tonight's lecture, I should say, is supported by the Robert B. Church Memorial Lecture Fund. I just want to say thanks to everybody for coming down on a Thursday. This is a little off schedule for us, and I really appreciate everyone being here tonight. Thanks also to the hard work of the committee. That's Gail, Rana, Jennifer Ackerman, and Diane Fox, myself. Thanks also to Jason for your continued support on all things lecture series related. Tonight, it's my pleasure to introduce Shannon Mattern. Shannon's an associate professor in the School of Media Studies at the New School in New York. Shannon is what I would like to call a media theorist, if I may. But it would be, I think, very easy to dismantle my assumption there by just simply surveying the things that she's interested in. In exchanges with Shannon over the content of what her lecture would be here at UTK, which gave me a sense of what she's working on at present, what she's currently up to, it became clear to me just how diverse and thorough her work really is. She ranges freely from artificial intelligence to ancient indigenous cartography, for instance, from extensive data centers to the library and archive of older times, or from fast-moving bits into dirt and grit. And she does all this, I might add, with a certain deftness and scholarly ease, it looks like to me. And she's also just really interesting. Shannon writes things that are fun to read, and that stitch things together in unexpected ways, but that also, when you read them, seem completely natural. She compares current ways of acting in the world, which seem very new and novel to all of us, to much older streams from where they came. She's the author of so many things that it's hard to pick just a few, but in particular, she's authored the books The New Downtown Library, Designing with Communities in 2006, Deep Mapping the Media City in 2015, and very recently, Code and Clay, Data and Dirt, 5,000 Years of Urban Media. That came out this year, just last week, as it turns out, all from the University of Minnesota Press. She also writes regularly for Places Journal, which is very interesting, really, really interesting journal to follow. For instance, articles like A City is Not a Computer, about ways of thinking about urbanism and urban culture within the logic of tech startups and near infinite data accumulations, or Mapping's Intelligent Agents, about kinds of machine vision that are becoming ubiquitous and how they re-render the world that we inhabit. Or even an interesting one for me, A Brief History of the Shelf, which is all about in which she enlivens perhaps the least considered part of the library or the archive, especially as it reflects on digitized present conditions like Amazon warehouses, for instance. I think Shannon's a kind of architectural secret agent. By virtue of finding all the connections and tethers between architecture and the rest of the world, she tends to see things that were right in front of us all along, but none of us yet knew how to recognize them. Instead of choosing a time, a place, or a particular set of content, she owns up to the 21st century's demand to find short circuits between them. And she's the kind of writer and scholar, I think, that can jar disciplines like architecture out of their own self-obsession and into a broader exchange with what courses through them. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Shannon Mattern.
Thank you. That was so nice. I hope this is being recorded because that was like the nicest introduction I've ever received, and when I'm depressed, I need to play that back, but not look at myself because I hate looking at pictures of myself. So just listen to the audio. So I want to thank Mark for bringing me here, and also thanks to Micah and Jason for providing great company and transportation, and to all the other faculty, and to you for being here. Maybe you have to be here, maybe you're here voluntarily. Either way, I really appreciate your being here. And so yes, as Mark said, I am in media studies, but I somehow have made an academic career intentionally disregarding disciplinary boundaries. I wouldn't advise that for everybody, but somehow I'm grateful it's worked for me, because I think most of the world's most interesting challenges and interesting things to think about go beyond the realm of any particular discipline anyway. So also I will say, when I was talking with Mark about what what would be a fitting thing to talk about here, he encouraged me to survey the breadth of what I do. That's not something that more traditional writers are asked to do. Artists and architects often do surveys of their work. Usually academics will present one particular project, one very specific thing. So it's kind of liberating and really nice to be able to just go over a survey of what I've done over the past several years and try to clump them into different themes. So I hope it's useful for you. So I will start by reading a little bit, and then I will drop the script and start just to talk more extemporaneously about some of these different projects. And also, I appreciate your dorkiness for actually wanting to come out for a talk that has index cards in the title. So, okay, sorry if I did that. All right, so epistemology is the study of knowledge. A mouthful of a word like this, you might presume, fits within the realm of philosophy. And you'd be right, it typically does. Philosophers are interested in what it means to know something, how much we can know, and how we come to know things. They're interested in how we use reason and our senses, our sight and hearing and touch, to know the world and to know one another, and even to grasp abstract concepts like love and truth and beauty. Yet debates over epistemology aren't just happening in the seminar rooms and dorm rooms of the academy. Today, thanks in part to the 2016 election and the new regime in Washington, epistemology is the stuff of dinner table conversations, newspaper articles, and White House press briefings. Ours is the era of fake news, alternative facts, and filter bubbles, of ransomware and rogue federal agency Twitter feeds, of massive document leaks and disappearing climate data. Faith and fact, suspicion and certainty are all tangled up. And I also want to emphasize that the politics of epistemology are party agnostics. This isn't a left or a right issue. It's definitely a discourse that kind of encompasses both. Meanwhile, in the labs of our premier research institutions, our major tech companies, scrappy startups, and even administrative offices, a new kind of certainty is taking hold. Algorithms offer ostensibly apolitical means of making data actionable, of tracking behaviors and filtering facts in order to determine what kinds of shoes you might like to purchase, or whether or not you get a mortgage, or what the terms of your parole might be, heaven forbid. Neural nets process data sets far larger than our brains could parse in a lifetime to aid in image and speech identification, in pattern recognition, and in predicting, for instance, where we should deploy disaster relief resources or invest in new infrastructure. These technologies have countless applications in architecture and urban planning and administration. The bigness of data engenders new ways of knowing. As Chris Anderson famously proclaimed in 2008, quote, "Petabytes allow us to say, correlation is enough. We can stop looking for models. We can analyze the data without hypotheses about what it might show. We can throw the numbers into the biggest computing clusters the world has ever seen and let statistical algorithms find patterns where science cannot," end quote. And in many cases, I'd add, where reason cannot. We don't know why there's a pattern, we just know there is one. This world of algorithmic absolutism isn't so far removed from the faith-based world of politics we see today, and not just today, kind of in perpetuity. The data-driven design studio and administrative office are both mobilized by faith in empiricism and faith in the machine. Faith in its omniscience, its inexhaustibility, the fact that it never gets tired crunching numbers, its supposed immunity to politics and to human error. So over the past 5 years or so, I've explored these new epistemologies of design in a series of articles for Places Journal, a venue for public scholarship on architecture, urbanism, and landscape. In Methodology and the Art of Measure, for instance, I looked at design's tendency to fetishize and aestheticize data. If you have a data visualization, it must be true, and it's really excitingly true, too. And to reify data-driven methods. In Interfacing Urban Intelligence and another article called History of the Urban Dashboard, I looked at how our interfaces to urban flows and data streams construct our understanding of what matters in a city, what's worth knowing, and how these technologies delimit our roles as urban subjects. The interface, in a way, defines our available modes of urban interaction. In Instrumental City, I studied New York's humongous Hudson Yard development on the far west side of Manhattan, which is either one of the biggest or the biggest real estate development projects in the United States, if not now, but one of the biggest in history, too. This is also where Alphabet, formerly Google's Sidewalk Labs, is headquartered, and where real estate developers, data scientists, and city officials are infusing smartness into everything imaginable. Its feats of structural, it's smart, it's infusing that smartness into its feats of structural engineering, its responsive architectures, its soil, as you can see on the left, even the soil is smart, its energy systems, its networks of sensors, its well-to-do inhabitants who will consent to allow managers to learn everything that they can about them through their smartphones and smart homes. The smart city is making an epistemological claim, which should make us wonder, what does a smart city know, and what are we supposed to know about its operations? Yet urban smartness isn't dependent on apps or an Internet of Things. As I argued in another piece for Places, the smart city's epistemological and technological foundations were laid long ago, even before the rise of computing as we know it today and before data-driven planning after the Second World War. The late 19th century brought us the index card and the file, two early data storage systems that not only prompted new modes of organizing information about people and urban operations, but also required newly designed furnishings and architectures to house them. These small material bits of information built a material world around themselves. Card catalogs, filing cabinets, and then offices that had to be optimized for the efficient flow of papers, and which were stacked atop one another to generate the enormous file of the skyscraper itself. Paul Otlet, a Belgian lawyer and information scientist, argued from the late 1890s to the 1930s that all the world's knowledge should be winnowed, his term, into the facts that could fit onto index cards. And all those cards should be collected in cabinets, which would then themselves be organized into buildings in a world city of knowledge designed by Le Corbusier. The plan never materialized, but this epistemological aspiration reflects a timeless interest. Getting all the world's scientists and scholars, accountants and actuaries, mayors and mathematicians on the same page, or the same card, so to speak, would promote world peace and efficient governance and advance the production of new knowledge. We said the same things in the early days of the internet. Mark Zuckerberg has made similar claims about Facebook until the whole Russia thing happened. And we've operated on similar principles of information management informing architectural and urban design for pretty much the entire history of urbanity. At least that's the premise of my new book, which was just published last Wednesday. In it, I argue that our cities have always been intelligent environments. They've always been designed to generate and organize information. And as I write in the book's introduction, this is a long quote, for millennia, our cities have been designed to foster broadcast. They've been wired, these are all kind of scare quotes around these, they've been wired for transmission. They've hosted architectures for the production and distribution of various forms of intelligence and served as hubs for record management. They've rendered themselves readable to humans and machines. They've even written their source code, their operating instructions on their facades and into the urban form itself. They've coded themselves for both the administrative technologies or proto-algorithms that oversee their operation and for the people who have built and inhabit and maintain them, end quote. For nearly 2 decades, I've been examining how material architectures map onto or mediate intellectual architectures, or you could substitute infrastructures for architectures, and vice versa. How our material world and the spaces and objects we design within it both shape and are shaped by our structures of thought. The ways we know the world shape the world we build, and that built world reflexively informs our knowing. And because different architectures or infrastructures are typically entwined or nested within each other across a scale, like the card in the card catalog or the widget in the interface, my exploration has traversed various scales, from the scale of the object, like the book, the file card, the field guide, the screen, the interface, the desk, to the architectural scale, the library, the archive, the urban intervention, the exhibition, the control center, to the urban scale, where I look at things like ancient urban record keeping and computational urban visions at World's Fairs or contemporary smart cities, up to the scale of the networks and clouds that link together and extend beyond these other sites of mediation. Thus, my research has also spanned different scales and practices of design, from interaction design, product design, furniture design, interior design, service design, architecture, urban design, and it's linked design to other fields, particularly information science, intellectual history, media studies, and geography. An implicit argument in all of this work, the research and writing, curating, and sometimes the events I organize myself, is the work that you do as designers, regardless of the scales at which you intervene, intersects with all these other scales of practice and these other disciplines and epistemological concerns. We come to know the world largely by material means, through the gadgets we create and the windows we frame. In designing that world, you, designers, participate in our ways of knowing. Every piece of furniture, every interface, every building, every urban plan can serve, doesn't have to, but can serve as an epistemological apparatus. You'll be pleased to hear that within a couple seconds or minute, I would say, I'm going to stop reading from this formal introduction and transition into a more informal survey of some of the projects I've undertaken over the years. But before I do so, I want to introduce a couple frameworks that will help to structure the examples to follow. So first is a theoretical framework. My own ways of knowing are certainly informed by all the theory and history I've read during and since graduate school. But it was only within the past few years that I came to realize why, for so long, theory was one way of knowing that made me somewhat uncomfortable. It's because the politics of theory's epistemological economy, if you can call it that, its knowledge politics, are so often based on a great men model. Deities and their dogmas, like you must be true to Derrida, or I don't know what the repercussions will be. So while the traces of my theoretical influence are present in my work, it's not very often that I explicitly name them. Yet I'll call out one, Foucault, whose notion of the tabula, the table, is both architectural and intellectual. Describing the fantastical list of objects in Borges's Chinese Encyclopedia, he contrasts the four-legged table, where we might lay out objects in order to determine their relationships to one another, to sort them. He contrasts that with the graphic table, something we might sketch out by hand or conjure up in Microsoft Word to organize our knowledge into rows and columns. I'm really interested in how we can map one table onto the other, how our ways of conceiving the world are made manifest in our ways of building the world, and vice versa. The second preliminary framework I'll offer is aesthetic. Art's subjectivity and willful non-systematicity might stand in contrast to the orderly compulsions of classification, which we saw in the last slide. Yet art, in all its affective excess and unruliness, has driven home for me that knowing is just as much sensory and experiential, just as much spatial and embodied as it is cognitive. So in each of the brief sections that follow, I'll integrate references to a few artists whose own attempts to materialize, architect, or perform epistemology have profoundly informed my own thinking. So I've classified my work into four sections: objects, architecture, cities, and networks. So first, media objects. So my work often, this is really helpful with teaching too, especially for students who are new to theory or history, to start with something really tiny and then spiral out from it to see how it's connected to all these interesting historical and theoretical and conceptual interests. So I just survey through a few of the projects that fit within this category. So if we look at contemporary cities, there are lots of objects that give us things to think with. The sensors that are embedded into the smart city, for instance. The interfaces that we have, which are sometimes our only means of accessing what's going on inside the operating system, which really don't reveal a whole lot. They're not going to tell us what the algorithms are determining. They're essentially just giving us whatever information the urban managers, interface designers essentially want us to know about how a city operates. And then you might also have some things like urban screens. These are links which were installed by Alphabet, again, formerly Google, to replace all of the payphones. Not all of them yet. They're still being rolled out in the more marginal neighborhoods. But in most of Manhattan, you see these big screen kiosks all around the city. So these are all objects that essentially allow us to interface with or mediate the smart city for us. And going back to some of those historical examples I mentioned earlier, there's a long history of building these little objects to help us interface urban intelligence. So you have people like Otlet, whom I mentioned earlier, who was really fascinated with the index card. So the index cards, if we say data is the new oil, index cards were Otlet's new oil. They were going to power economies and all kinds of scientific discoveries. And they scaled up into architectures, exhibitions. So a lot of these World's Fairs in particular, which is another area of thing I've looked at in my research, is a lot of the World's Fairs from the late 19th to the mid 20th century really looked at the power of these tiny, small moving bits of information, either digital data or analog data, to really revolutionize the world. So I have a couple examples of how these different World Expos, which is where, as you probably know, different countries of the world come together to show their cultural prowess and their technological developments. And in many cases, throughout that long period of history, it's small moving bits of information that were kind of the foundational principle for all the grand new things you're going to make in the world. So as with Otley, the index card built into these, which he demonstrated in all of these World Expos, were going to necessitate new furnishings, which would require new cities. Again, Otley partnered with Le Corbusier to design this Cité Mondiale, this world city. And they would connect all of the world in these lovely new networks of knowledge sharing. If we look at the 1939 World's Fair, which this is the pylon and I forget what the name of the other thing is. The two figures, the sphere and the two signal. Pardon me? The obelisk, yes. Okay, so this is on Flushing Meadows in New York. So again, here we see lots of people exhibiting new bits of information and how they're going to be incredibly revolutionary. So we have exhibitors like AT&T showing a lot of their new technologies, including the voter, as you see in the middle, maps of like network infrastructures. We have companies like Remington Rand, who started off making rifles, then moved into typewriters, and now they do all kinds of weird logistics stuff. But they were showing all of their new modes of organizing paperwork. So they put on display the indexing systems they had for people to organize information. So you can see here, this is actually a World's Fair exhibit. Looking at office work probably doesn't sound super exciting to you, but this is what they display. Like, this is the future of efficient urban administration. You know, women who are using standardized forms, envelopes on standardized sized desks, which make our cities move more efficiently and make world peace in the end, to make a big leap in logic. This is another slide from a Remington Rand, from some archival research I did. They also showed how photography, they were really pushing microphotography, which was the archiving time of thing of the day. Now we want to digitize everything to make it ever, present for the entire history of humanity, which, as you probably know, is not true. The digital record is incredibly fragile and fickle. But here they were proposing microphotography, like microfiche and microfilm. I don't know how old all of you are, but I am sad for you that you did not have the pleasure of scrolling through microfilm and microfiche in the library. It's a beautiful thing aesthetically, and it's just so delightfully frustrating that it kind of makes you appreciate. Nobody's laughing, but this is hysterical to people who know what we're talking about. But they were proposing microphotography. If you could just take pictures of everything in the world, and make it really, really tiny, you could fit all of the world's information on these tiny little cards of smushed up images. So microphotography, small bits of information, again, was one of their proposed solutions. Then we skip forward to the 1964 World's Fair, where you see this big kind of iconic sculpture, which if any of you have been to Flushing Meadow or the Queen's Museum, this is still there today. IBM was one of the big signature exhibitors there, and they had what their exhibit was made to look like the type ball of a typewriter, essentially. And once you get inside, Charles and Ray Eames designed a lot of the exhibits there, and they really played on the idea of kind of multiple screens, tiny bits of information, not always making sense or gelling, but just the power of the flow of information, of tiny bits of knowledge kind of coming at you. This was the future that we had to prepare ourselves for. Other exhibitors like NCR, which dealt with like cash registers, a lot of the bling that you would take away from the fair were like, hey, look at this cool printout, or put in your birthday. We'll give you a little printout, a little receipt that tells you who has your birthday. Or take home this souvenir punch card, for instance. So these tiny bits of data were things that you would take home with you as a symbol of, the new material culture of new bits of information that were, again, going to revolutionize the world. This is an example of some of the punch cards you would take. As you can see at the top, this is certain significant events that might have happened on your birth date. And then all those little bits of information would add up to a new revolutionary future. If you go through the Futurama exhibit, for instance, you would see Progress Land, a world of kind of fantastical architecture, of amazing structural engineering. I didn't include some of these pictures, but a lot of them showed people living on the moon, people living under oceans, us colonizing jungles and inhospitable landscapes. And all of this would be in part fueled by all this new data that we were generating. So the little scales up to the big. Another tiny piece of moving piece of information, specifically about design, I've been interested in is the history of, and the contemporary culture of zines and architectural publications. So around the mid-2000s to the 2010s or so, there were a whole bunch of exhibits and projects of people both making and cataloging design zines. Part of that was because of the economy of the time. There weren't a whole lot of commissions, so if you couldn't build buildings, you kind of architected publications. A lot of the people making zines around this time and in precursor times really looked at the act of making small publications as an architectural form itself. You didn't just create a standard book, you really experimented with the structure of the publication. So this was a project I did looking at a couple related exhibits that happened not only in New York, but traveled around the world. One was called Clip Stamp Fold, organized by Beatrice Colomina, chronicling architecture zines and tiny magazines from the 1960s, I believe, up through the contemporary day. Another one was called A Few Zines, another exhibit of architectural, material publications. And then the last one happened at Storefront for Art and Architecture that was all about the explosion of blogging culture in architecture in the late 2000s. So what they did there, I think I have a picture of it. On the right here, you can see they had to somehow make that material too. So they took all these really new architecture blogs at the time, like Building Blog, and I know that Jeff Manaugh is going to be coming here in the spring, right? And other people like Pruned and Mimi Zieger's work. I'm not sure if she's ever been here. She had a blog called Loud Paper. So they made it into an exhibit by printing out those tiny little pieces of journalism and putting them on the wall and then having a big event where all of the big bloggers of the day came together. So looking at how these new tiny pieces of architectural discourse, either material in the form of publications, even in this digital age, there was this huge resurgence of making physical things to read, architecting actual publications, or the rise of blogging culture, how these tiny forms of discourse would revolutionize the culture. Just another one, Archizines, which I've also reviewed. This one traveled around quite a bit. This was a very international collection of publications. This is just a side note, or I guess you could say a footnote. A related project I did was I edited a collection about the history of lists and notes, which again might sound super boring, but I like looking at incredibly boring bureaucratic things, I guess. So we had looked at the history of note-taking, the history of the commonplace book, looked at new note-taking software and how that structures the way we think about things, like how does Evernote or how does taking voice notes on your phone structure the way you think about breaking your world and your memorable parts of your day into bits. And then I also got a curator from the Smithsonian, Liza Kerwin, who had just organized a big traveling exhibit about artists' notes and lists that they collected from the archives, and she included a few pieces. And then Lisa Gittleman, a media historian, is really interested, like me, in boring administrative things. So she looked at the history of technologies of attachment. So the little paperclip that we now click on our email or whatever now to say attach. She wanted to say, where did that form come from? So she did all this interesting archival research to see the historical forms of paper attachment. And when we scale up from the card or the file, another thing I'm interested in is kind of systems for keeping records. There's a really great library in Brooklyn called the Reanimation Library, which is essentially a library of misfit books. This artist/librarian named Andrew Bacone goes around to yard sales, swap meets, the days that the library sales where they get rid of all of their outmoded books, and he buys the knowledge that nobody wants anymore, because he's essentially saying that this is really great intellectual history. We can learn a lot about the history of graphic design, how knowledge has evolved by collecting old textbooks about physics or health, or cookbooks with Jell-O molds from the 1970s that nobody makes anymore. There's a lot to learn about culture and intellectual history through these old books that don't really have factually accurate stuff in them anymore. And he invites writers and artists to come and find these weird books in their collections and make stuff out of them. So I wrote a piece my piece starts by saying this book was so boring I had to walk laps on my roof to keep myself awake while I read it. But it's a training manual for secretaries for how to organize records. But some of the most beautiful design things came out of it. These are some of the graphics in there. The fact that filing is this supposedly exciting, aestheticized thing with all these colors. And you can buy these really great little shiny stars and tabs to put in your files to make it exciting and findable. Look at these beautiful machines too. You can put a hole through, there's a kind of a lineup of holes that might be a particular category of card. You stick your knitting needle through them and it pulls up only those cards that relate to that particular category. And then you have different types of files, beautiful furniture that the whole scene generated as well. So again, scaling up from the tiny bits of information to the more macro scale stuff. A lot of this work is also informed by one of my favorite classes to teach. It's a graduate seminar called Data Archive Infrastructure, where we look at the history, politics, aesthetics of organizing information. Everything from the history of classification systems to what do you do for performative cultures that really maybe aren't text-based, like indigenous cultures? How do you archive ephemeral media, like sound art, or all kinds of interesting stuff. Tons of artists have been inspired by the archive in their work, so we look at a lot of that kind of work too. So all my class websites are available online if you want to look at any of the readings or see what we do. So these are all linked to through my website. And just going back to the scale of furniture, this is a longer-term project I did that I've started at a fellowship in Germany a couple years ago about intellectual furnishings or cabinet logics. So how the furniture we design shapes the way we compartmentalize the world and interact with media. So a couple of those examples are one is the piece that Mark alluded to, published in Harvard Design Magazine last fall about the history of the shelf. This is such a nondescript, who cares kind of piece of furniture, especially the billy shelf that you just work to death until it breaks and then put out on your stoop. But these are an incredibly important infrastructure that has organized our life since Neolithic times, really. So I look at kind of that long history. Also looking at all the other interesting machines and shelving devices, organizing devices people have designed to store and facilitate our access to media. The book wheel. You don't want to just read one book. Now we have the iPad that you can take on vacation with you and have 20 books. Why would you bother if you could have a book wheel in your living room where you could read 20 books at the same time? When books were very precious, often hand copied, they were really expensive. So not everybody you couldn't check them out of the library. So they literally chained them to the shelves, as some of you might know. And then that informed all kinds of really fantastic new architectures, like Labrousse libraries, for instance, really taking advantage of the rise of accessible books, new steel forms of architecture, and really creating the library, the grand library that we know of today. Continuing that on into the mid-century, when you had certain things like the radios and televisions entering people's homes, bringing new, both exciting and scary technologies. If I can see through that glass eye out to the world, can the world see into my living room too? So George Nelson and other really well-known designers created furnishings to help people compartmentalize their media and sometimes shut the door on it when you didn't want it spying on your family's dinner, for instance. Then you have like Dieter Rams 606 shelving, which kind of float. This is about 10 times as expensive as this stuff is, like your IKEA shelf, for instance. But this levity of some of you might have seen the Dieter Rams in person, but it's a very expensive and kind of high modern thing that's supposed to make the stuff of your life kind of just float off the ground, essentially. And then we have even a new logic of shelving with like the IKEA storeroom, where your books and your DVDs, which we don't really watch anymore, other media things might be stored next to socks or marshmallows, just because people tend to buy those things together. So it's not as if you have a biology section and then the George Orwell section. It's not organized by human intelligible logic. It's organized by logistics and purchasing behaviors. So new shelving is accommodating new ways of thinking about the world. Another project I did with some architects and product designers at Parsons was most cities have this. Your library system probably has library service for incarcerated people who cannot go to their own public library. They will take a collection of books into the correctional facilities. The librarians in New York who do that, and several of their many correction facilities, were using lunch carts with broken wheels. And as you probably know, prisons are not the most kind of well-kept facilities. They have uneven floors. It was really difficult for them to do a very stressful job. So we all did a shift of library service in one of the correctional facilities, and then the architects and product designers worked with the librarians to design what they thought would be the most functional library cart to dignify their work and make it easier to do. And I know you might think pink is very stereotypical, but the women in the women's prison specifically asked for a pink cart to kind of, I don't know, I'm not going to go into gender stereotypes here, but it's kind of obviously gender stereotyped. But this is a really meaningful project for a lot of the students involved. And I have then scaled up from furniture to look at the closet. Again, another thing that who thinks to study this kind of stuff? Well, I do apparently. So looking at the history of, starting off with the premise that if I look into my closet right now, one entire shelf is dedicated to my old time capsules, old hard drives that I don't really want to do away with, floppy disks that I don't even have the ports to access anymore, cables from like, I just got a new iMac, and all of my old cables became obsolete. So I have boxes of this stuff. So it's a graveyard for old media, essentially. So looking at the how we can kind of psychologize the closet to see what kind of things we store and how we organize it. Looking at examples of kind of when the closet was actually a fancy private room, essentially. The closet came to be a more private thing over the course of time. Again, looking at like a lot of George Nelson's storage wall, how it actually had closets built into it. And then here's an example of like a closet full of all of these old media that you just either don't know what to do with, don't know how to responsibly discard with, or because of data security, you don't really want to give your old hard drive over to a recycling facility because who knows who's going to read that stuff. So there are all kinds of kind of worries or phobias that might keep us preserving these dead things. There are lots of artists who actually work with some of these ideas. I wrote a piece for Volume a couple years ago about the artist Zoe Beloff, who plays with the furniture of office work, essentially. And she's drawing on some of you might know the research of Frank and Lillian Gilbreth, who in the early 20th century really wanted to make office workers much more efficient, to do their paperwork more efficiently. So they would use like early forms of motion pictures, attach lights to people's fingers, and ask women to stuff envelopes or file folders, and take movies of them to see the light show that essentially kind of emerged from that, so they could prescribe more efficient gestures to make people stuff envelopes faster. I was going to say elephants stuff envelopes faster, or to do paperwork faster. This, again, was going to make people more money, make the world more efficient. These movement of small moving parts of information. I also worked with some product designers, furniture designers at Parsons to do a class-based project, an exhibit called Furnishing the Cloud, where they were considering what's the ergonomics of new media? What kind of furniture do we need in an era when we're usually lounging, reading iPads or phones? What would furniture look like in this new age? So they just made a lot of kind of cardboard-based mock-ups, but this was an exhibit that was up for a few weeks. Just a couple weeks ago on eFlux, I published a thing about tables and furniture of Silicon Valley. So you might have seen the kind of crazy video that Facebook put out to celebrate its 1 millionth or billionth user called Chairs Are Like Facebook. So I kind of took that literally and looked at the furniture of Silicon Valley, because there's been a lot of controversy about sexism and the disregard for marginalized people in Silicon Valley. So I wanted to see how their workplaces are structured and how the facilities people are given to do that work might contribute to the way they do their work and the way they interact with each other. So this, for example, Danish furniture is a really big thing, as it is pretty much everywhere. So you have like the Hans Wegner Papa Bear chairs, which when you had a terrible day at Facebook, you can go and the chair can hug away your pain. This is Evernote, where they have the chalkboard wall, and again, more Danish furniture. It's the shell chair. And what do you think this is on the right? It's the new Apple headquarters, which is like oppressive minimalism. So there's no joy here. Your joy is outside in the nature park that you can actually access, I guess, until I think you can go in the interior part of the donut and access the nature. But so a lot of this work is informed, again, by artists who have played with these ideas, like Doris Salcedo, who does a lot with loss and genocide and how furniture is a way to kind of contain memories. So she takes like these cabinets, which if you know Bachelard, it's all about opening up the cabinet and smelling the raisins and having memories flood out to you. Here, they're stuffed with concrete. So what does that say about like the pain of memories and kind of a culture that has been gripped with genocide? And so she's one artist who's been really inspirational to me. And then Alan Wexler, who's really playful. He's an architect and furniture designer who really, when he designs like a kitchen, for instance, he'll say like, what is the essence of kitchenness? Let's forget all the appliances you can buy, the fact that, we have modularized cupboards we can buy. What do I need to do in a kitchen? And this kind of goes back to our discussion, Micah, about you renovating your home and the fact that your kitchen is right now across 5 different rooms of your house. Maybe you like it that way, maybe you don't. But he's asking these kinds of questions about the basic ontological needs of a function, like what does it mean to sleep? What does it mean to eat together with people? And how can we rethink the fundamental typology of chairs and tables and furniture that will facilitate that stuff? Okay, that was the longest section. The next one is media architectures, and here we looked at the Apple interior. This is what the building looks like from the outside. So if we scale up from furniture, how do these shape the scale of architecture? So a couple of the projects I did, this was a while ago, when the new CCTV building opened, the OMA building in Beijing in time for the Olympics. I looked at that and how it kind of reflects the public relations stunts of a state-driven television corporation, kind of broadcasting its prowess to the world. And this is Frank Gehry's IAC building, which is a whole hodgepodge of different media companies like Match.com and a bunch of other random websites, and how this kind of reflects this crystalline fluidity of what the new media economy is supposed to be. But if you look at the outside, it's quite different from the weird floor plan you get on the inside. And imagine being the person who has to work in a little point and you can't really roll your roller chair around anywhere. Or the fact that, yes, you might get lovely tropical candy-colored divider screens, but you're still in cubicles. So there's not a whole lot of radicalism from the outside that transfers to the interior. I've also done a lot of work on libraries. So and then fortunately been asked by different schools and cities who have been designing libraries to go and talk to them about some of the things I've studied. So just examples, this is something I presented at Pratt and Yale and the big academic librarians conference, the big National Academic Librarians Conference. This one is a thing I presented at Smith. They just hired, what's the woman who did the Vietnam Memorial? I'm blanking on her name. Maya Lin is designing their new library. Everybody knows that one, apparently. So she's designing their new library, so they asked me to go and talk to them about things I had seen they might want to think about. But it all started with my dissertation over 15 years ago, where I was actually there for the design, kind of did ethnographic research on the design of the OMA's Seattle Public Library, which was, some people regard like the building of the decade, really revolutionized how people would access information and how architecture could give shape to information. So that's kind of where a lot of this interest started. This one, if you subscribe to any architecture blogs, you've probably seen this 5,000 times in the past week. I don't really know what I think about it. Most of those books aren't really books. They're just painted on the walls. There's no way to reach a lot of those. So I'm a little anti this design. I would have to write something to figure out what I think about it. But it's definitely circulating in all of the design world this past week or so. Another project I did was, I'm really interested in kind of niche collections. You probably tell I'm into lots of niche things. But this was in 2006, there's very few total designs by Alvar Aalto in the United States, one of which is his Woodbury Poetry Room at Harvard in its Lamont Library, its undergraduate library. In 2006, over the summer, this is how the story goes. The librarians did a stealth renovation without really talking to the people in the Graduate School of Design, which of course, as you can imagine, did not go over well. So I wanted to look at the history of the building. I just love the idea of a library dedicated solely to poetry, and what would that mean? And it's specifically in an undergrad library. I wanted to make undergrads really get into poetry. So I looked at how there are chapbooks and records and all kinds of media forms in this space, and how the room itself was designed to accommodate all these different types of activity. So these are some renderings from the Artec archives. These are some images from the time the building opened by Servin Robinson, a really well-known architectural photographer who I was able to talk to about his work with this project. This is from 1949, when records were the new media. So they have these 4 of these huge record players that are octagonal, where if you bring your class in, 8 of you can sit around a record player and listen to a recording of a poet reading his or her own work together. And that was kind of an interesting, very revolutionary pedagogical tool. The room is also modularizable. The stuff is meant to move around, so it can be not only a space of learning, but a space of production. So when you listen to other people's work, you read their chapbooks, you look through their archives, then you can move the tables around and actually have a workshop of you producing your own work. So it's a generative space too. And These are just two examples of different public events that are happening there. I've also looked at the 40th anniversary of Louis Kahn's Exeter Library, which was really designed with the module of the book to be central. All of these kind of mythological, classical forms of circles and squares, etc., and the rectangular shape of the book. How does a building like this allow itself to be updated for an era of networks, was essentially what I was asking. And some of them are really kind of awkward fits. There are wires running all across the floor, and it looks a little awkward to see a big bank of computers next to the card catalog, which at least when I was there was still there, not used. It was kind of a monumental furniture to an old age of information. It was kind of hearkening back to the age of Otley. Just some interior spaces. The Carrolls, this is a private residential school, as you might know, Exeter Academy. And just the way students really personalize their carrolls. I don't know that there's not really a carrol culture in university libraries anymore, is there? Does anybody have a carrol? Do you even know what I'm talking about? Wow. Microfiche and carrolls are two things you guys are missing out on. But the students have their own private study spaces. They kind of decorate them like their dorm rooms and personalize these kind of information spaces for themselves. Another project from about a decade ago was this new audiovisual library for the entire state or the entire country of the Netherlands, where they have taken stills from a lot of their state television and state film production and essentially baked them into glass and made that the facade of the building. So in a way, it's kind of old media, it's stained glass, which in pre-literate cultures was the way you would communicate biblical stories to people in a church, but it's made for a digital kind of post-electronic media age. And it's kind of also interesting, the archives of the subterranean space with this like very ominous orange glow, like it's almost, the archives are Hades in a way. I'm not quite sure if that's the effect they were going for, but there is a kind of a interesting symbolic nature to putting the archives in this orange light below ground. And these projects are informed by a couple other classes I teach. One is a course on media and architecture, where we look at the whole history. We start with like digital forms and move backwards in time to see how different media technologies have informed architecture all the way back to oral culture. And then another class on sound and space, because I'm really interested in thinking about beyond the visual, that the media are tactile and sonic, and spaces have all these senses too, and how we should think about things in a multisensorial way. I'm going to skip over some because I am speaking way too much about each of these. But scaling up from architecture further is another. I mean, I think some of the pieces that Jason sent around indicate that I do a little work on infrastructure. So the value of thinking about certain types of architectures like libraries as infrastructures is a piece that I wrote. And then I looked at some of those logistical infrastructures. So I tracked the system behind the scenes by which media are transferred among the 200 plus branch libraries in New York City, which was a really interesting kind of almost FedEx-like logistical treasure hunt, I guess you could say. And then there are really interesting archives that actually exist in decommissioned mines underground, which were salt mines, limestone mines, because they have such a cool, controllable climate. They become the perfect place for Warner Brothers and 20th Century Fox and Corbis, the image people, to actually keep their original copies of their films, their silent films, their nitrate film. And they're being used more and more for data centers too. So these subterranean places of extraction are being used for preservation of media too. And this is going to come out with New Geographies, the Harvard Graduate School of Design magazine, in a couple weeks. One thing I published just on Tuesday was about another kind of esoteric archive, and that is the archives of climate science. We think that climate science is this very heavily data-driven thing, and it is. But to get data science before 150 years ago, you can't rely on readings. People weren't taking or recording regularly weather readings. Instead, they have to use proxies, material proxies, ice cores, sediment samples, rocks. So when you decide whether Yucca Mountain is an appropriate site for storing nuclear waste, for instance, you have to listen to the rocks tell you about how they were going to keep their secrets, keep your secrets inside, essentially. So this was a project, as I said, just came out a couple days ago. And other tiny libraries. This is kind of passé now. I don't know if they were big maybe 5 or 6 years ago where you lived with the whole little library movement. Maybe they still are, I'm not sure. They were ubiquitous, annoyingly so, in New York about 5 or 6 years ago. But they also have some really interesting kind of parallel projects, like the fact that the People's Library was a central part of Zuccotti Park, the stuff that was happening in New York in 2011. And then architects, like developing interesting modular public space type libraries and how you might make these important ways for people to reclaim for a temporary period public space for epistemological purposes. So the next to last is media cities. And I've already talked about a lot of these, kind of previewed at the very beginning some of the work I've done on smart cities in particular. But looking again at the fact that there is a history to them, I talked a bit about how all the world's fairs tried out all these new analog forms of small moving parts that would shape more efficient cities. Also looked at historic infrastructures. This is like our pre-Wi-Fi days. I'm not sure if Knoxville has a history of this, but lots of cities had pneumatic tubes running underneath the streets that were used in mail delivery, some of which have been repurposed for threading through fiber optic cables, so this layering of new and old infrastructures. I'll skip over this one. A lot of this is all the city scale projects. I wanted to see also what people in other parts of the world are doing. This, you might know, Korea, South Korea prides itself on being one of the most technologically advanced countries. But about 10, 15 years ago, some, particularly in the publishing world, were very concerned by the breakneck speed of development, both urban development, which produced a lot of disasters like collapsed shopping malls and other things that were based on faulty construction, and the fact that they were losing their long tradition of printing. Korea and China were printing well before Gutenberg developed the printing press. So they lamented the loss of this culture. So a lot of the big printers, the high caliber literary presses and art presses, moved out of Seoul, moved north about 30 miles to right near the demilitarized zone, and made an architectural showcase called Paju Book City. They had a whole bunch of well-known architects develop signature buildings that all of these publishers inhabited. So they had this little enclave of publishing near the DMZ, in the rice marshes north of the city of Seoul. So this is kind of a counter to this. It's a form of intelligence that's a counter to the smart city that's happening 30 miles to the south. Mark also mentioned this piece I wrote where I'm kind of pushing against the idea of smart cities, called The City is Not a Computer. What's lost when we think about the city as an information processing machine? And that's also the premise for a studio I teach in the spring called Urban Intelligence, where students get into groups and think about other ways that places can be smart that isn't just about the branded, proprietary, algorithmic way of thinking about smartness today. I'm also looking at how publics and cities can be smart. So I've looked at the importance of public data, map libraries, all these ways that people, everyday citizens, can get forms of spatial urban intelligence that make them smart citizens to counteract kind of the proprietary surveillance nature of a lot of smart urbanism. And the final part, mapping across scales. So there was kind of you could see this image kind of translating into this last section where all this work, I hope you see how one nests into the other. The tiny piece becomes a filing system, becomes a piece of furniture, becomes an architecture, kind of scales up to a city. It's not causal, it just may be like a formal resonance that goes across them. And one way to maybe think about these is through the methodology of mapping. And that's something that I wrote a tiny book about. It's also the subject of a class I teach every fall, a studio called Maps as Media, where we look at the history, politics, aesthetics of mapping. And again, just as I said before, I really like to think beyond the visual. So I'm really encouraging both in my own work and my students' work to think about the fact that knowledge isn't only cognitive and seeing stuff, it's also hearing and touching and experiencing in an embodied way. So reinforcing the value of multisensorial and affective mapping. And this was a piece that came out about 6 weeks ago, I guess, looking first of all at all the new, amazingly revolutionary things that are happening in mapping thanks to machine intelligence and neural nets and self-driving cars, which I don't find the cars very interesting at all, but the stuff they're doing with sensing the world is really interesting, and how that can be applied to human concerns like human rights and development and disaster preparedness. But also what's left out. What other forms of intelligence are left out of machine intelligence? Indigenous intelligences. The ways that Polynesian cultures, for instance, navigate the seas and have for thousands of years. It's based on feeling swells of waves actually reflect back from nearby islands. So just as, LIDAR and radar are based on reverberation, the way Pacific Islanders are actually dealing with navigating huge expanses of sea are also based on a very analog form of reverberation or reflection. And then other species too. Especially if we want to think about climate change, we should understand how animals sense space, other species, and think about how they have a cartographic sensibility too. Monkeys have been shown to think about space in both Euclidean and non-Euclidean ways. So there's a really interesting spatial sensibility there to think through. So this is just repeating some of what I said earlier about machine vision. These are all the interlocking forward and backward framing mirrors on a Tesla, for instance. And this is using machine vision to identify kind of particular features in a landscape so that development organizations or officials can actually know where to target their services. And these are some examples of some of the more indigenously informed, other species types of projects, and community mapping too, which really gets at those other intelligences that aren't easily machined. A lot of my students then, it's how do you make a map that incorporates all this stuff? So what my students often want to do is create one map that has it all, which is impossible. So instead, we encourage them to make an atlas. So to have different components making different arguments. And in concert, they're all kind of informing, reflecting one another. So this is an example of a project on urban renewal, looking at policies and the consequences of different policies of urban renewal by a student, Jakob Winkler. And you can see he's dealing with time and different forms of legislation and mapping kind of the presence of particular features in the urban landscape. Hemming Zhang was thinking about what walkability is. You probably know that walkability, according to the Jan Gehl school, has a score. You can give a number to a neighborhood based on how walkable it is. She thinks this is really reductive, particularly in Chinatown in New York, where so much of the culture happens in unofficial ways on the streets. So she wanted to find new ways using ethnographic research, interesting forms of qualitative mapping that really reflected the richness of street culture and walkability. So her atlas incorporates all these different ways of mapping together. And even beyond the map, there's a way for you to go out into the world and kind of map in experientially. So I did a piece a few years ago about infrastructural tourism, about, I don't know if this is popular here, but it has been in New York, like let's go take a field trip to the container port, or let's go down into the sewer, or let's go visit data centers. So people want to know how their infrastructure works. So actually going and experiencing and smelling and feeling the friction in these places is an integral part to understanding how our hidden infrastructures work. And there are lots of artists and designers who have done work in that area. The follow-up piece was called Cloud and Field, and that's looking at extreme tourism, where you have people like the Unknown Fields Division who will take you, if you can pay them $3,000, they will take you to the Atacama Salt Flats in Chile, or up to the North Pole where there's a huge array of satellites. So you can experience the frigidity, the extreme landscapes of these kind of often military or secret logistical supply chains that make our cell phones or that make our cell networks work. And people like Ingrid Burrington have created field guides to these as well. So trying to take these inscrutable networks that are urban but also go way beyond the urban scale and give us a little thing to think with, going back to the index card maybe, to help us try to make sense, to figure out where the internet lives or where cell phone infrastructure lives. Drawing connections, and because I'm looking at field guides, I really dug into the history of bird watching and the whole history of the field guide itself, the naturalist field guide. So the challenges of scaling up from the small index to comprehend vast geographies is really what that piece, and I guess my work as a whole is really looking at. And this is another example. There's a speculative design group in London called Superflux who made a drone aviary, like a field guide to drones. So if you look at different drones, almost like a bird guide, you know, drones do kind of look like birds. How could you look at the typology and identify different kinds of drones? And then how do you scale up from that to understand a vast geography like the internet? This is how we typically represent what the internet looks like. Another artist or, I guess, designer that I've really drawn inspiration from in a lot of this mapping work is James Corner, who's very reflexive about the technologization, the fact that the tools we build, the scales we create, really inform the way we see the world and how we think to measure it. So his work has been very important for me and in the maps class I teach. And I think it's really important to consider as you do that scaling up, as you go from the tiny to the big or the big to the tiny, all the epistemological, going back to that early mouthful of a word I said at the very beginning, ethical and political implications of that rescaling. Who's left out, who's included. And I'll close with one artist who I think is probably one of my favorite artists of all time, who really embodies a lot of these interests. Is anyone familiar with the work of Anne Hamilton? Okay, so she's new to all of you. That's good, or most of you, I think. So she deals a lot, she's an installation artist, deals a lot with the idea of memory and the archive and embodied labor, marginalized cultures. And this was a piece that was in the Park Avenue Armory, a huge cavernous space in New York that happened about 3 or 4 years ago, and I took my archives class there to visit it. And it's going back to the previous slides showing birds. Birds were an integral part of this exhibition. So these are pigeons, hearkening to carrier pigeons. So there's a whole mix of media formats. She's kind of incorporating in all of her installations different forms of archival materiality. So we have the bird. Animals, horses and birds in particular, have been integral parts of human communication throughout history. We rely on them to transfer our messages for us. And then you contrast that with the text, somebody reading this kind of live, algorithmically generated text. So it's old and new media together. This is the space as a whole. A huge curtain was strung up, and you could sit on these swings. And as you swung on the swings, you would generate a breeze to actually move the curtain. You might think I'm kind of reading too much into the symbolism, but in a way this is kind of evocative of the breath, the voice, and the power that like one little breeze can have when it's collectively captured together, can move this huge piece of fabric in the middle of the room. All kinds of media formats, again, as I said before, birds and text. These little bags are full of radios, of kind of live generated audio. This is a live making of a record based on the sound in the room. And then these are people like erasing text at the same time. So recognizing as we're capturing and memorializing, it's also important to think about what needs to be erased or forgotten too. So her work is really complicated and poetic and very multisensory, but I think it really captures a lot of these issues of scale and what's worth knowing and how the physical world actually gives shape to what we know and can know and should know. And this is just a little collage of a lot of her work you see here. Even clothing. She thinks of fabric, and history of embroidery, of weaving, of ink, braille text over there on the left, making and unmaking of books. All of these are kind of brought together in her work. Both the tiny often scaling up to the big. And that's all I have, so thank you. Sure, if anybody has questions or comments, I'm happy to take some. Oh, over here, sorry, yes. I had all these hands pointing, and I'm just following the train of hands. Okay. Okay.
Thank you so much. That was fantastic. I was curious about your research methods and projects seem to have such different information in them, and how you go about getting that information, how you decide how to go about it.
That's a very good question. And I have to teach a research methods class, which I haven't done for about a decade in the spring. So I have to kind of discipline my own undisciplined methodology. But I had a lot of archival images in here, you might have noticed. So some of the work I do is archival research. I do a lot of interviews, a lot of site visits, a lot of ethnographic research. So really it kind of depends upon the project. If it's something I can visit, something that's feasible to visit, something where a company will actually talk to me, or the creator is still alive, I think that actually going there, experiencing it over a scale of time, not just like one afternoon, to see what it feels like in different times and seasons, talking to the people involved. So incorporating, I don't do quantitative methods very much, although I'm critiquing through a lot of my data-driven projects. I'm often critiquing quantitative methods, but content analysis is not really something I do. But it's mostly a mix of qualitative and ethnographic-based methods and archival research. Mm-hmm. Yes? How do I personally deal with them?
Or think other people should deal with them if you're having those sorts of existential crises about the scenario being the facets.
Well, there are a couple different fronts. I mean, one of the projects I kind of skipped through really quickly was the one called Public Information, where I'm looking at how if people are going to be living in an era of increasing surveillance and data capture, they should have more data literacy, some statistical literacy. I mean, in a talk I did recently, some undergraduates, I was at UCLA last week, they came up and said, do you think it's a problem that people don't know what statistics, if you're not, statistics isn't a language that everybody speaks, yet we seem to so readily consume facts and figures. So they were asking these, freshman psychology majors, do you think everybody should have to learn statistics? And I said, that's not a bad idea. I think that'll make a lot of people mad. It's a new requirement in your kind of high school curriculum or your freshman requirements. But given the fact that so much rationale for how policy is determined, how healthcare is distributed, et cetera, is driven by data, algorithms determine, as I said, not only what shoes Amazon's going to show you, but also what in China with their social score, you probably know this, I forget what it's called, the social, does anybody know what I'm talking about? China has essentially given a social kind of compliance score to everyone now that's based on your ability to pay your bills on time. They're measuring all kinds of things they can measure, which will determine essentially whether or not your kids will get into their top choice schools, whether you will get a mortgage, whether kind of there will be more oversight as to whether you pay your bills on time. Also, it's supposed to be made public, so the impetus is that there'll be social shaming as well, so you'll be less likely to get a date or get married if your social score is low. So I'm just contributing to the fear factor here, but what I say is knowing about these things, developing data literacy, knowing about the ways to search securely and privately, how to secure your devices is another important thing. Maybe going to live in like the quiet zone of West Virginia might be another alternative too, where there are or at Oak Ridge, like you could go work at Oak Ridge where apparently you can't have a cell phone on the facility or something. That's what I've heard today. But the opting out entirely seems to be a really extreme and kind of naive measure to some people. But marshaling, like the data literacy part and pushing back, developing civic tech is another thing that some people are advocating for too. So public generated technology to offer an alternative to, or to push back against a lot of the corporately defined stuff. So those are just some options. Mm-hmm.
There are a few moments where you spoke about the kind of esoteric, this kind of esoteric collection in the reading rooms, and you also started to mention towards the end these kind of forgotten ways of seeing space through information and data. So I'm trying to kind of loop that back onto the beginning where it seems like data and information in all of these scales is so much about producing regularity and consistency and building efficiencies into the system, and that everything else gets kind of erased or removed. And so I'm wondering about if you confronted in any moments these kind of misfit conditions, maybe on the kind of more individual or one-off scale, or the kind of these kind of hyper singularities that that people have to confront, or that environments needed to confront and didn't do so well.
Well, there are a couple of different examples. I mean, one of them is the fact that the data that cities collect about the efficiency of urban systems, the metrics they collect have to be about things that actually lend themselves to measurement and to datification. And there are certain things like public health, for instance. Some cities will do things like sentiment analysis. They'll look at the people's tweets and see are they using happy things or sad words. Lev Manovich is doing facial recognition of your Instagram pictures and seeing if you're smiling. A machine will see if you're smiling or you're sad. And he kind of makes an affective measure about the city as to are people in Finland happier or sadder than people in Uruguay, for instance. All kinds of methodological problems with assumptions like that. But those are the things that don't really readily lend themselves to machine vision or algorithmicization or quantification, or some of those things that slip through the data model itself. But if you talk to any archivists, particularly those that work with kind of marginalized populations, indigenous populations, there are things that sometimes they just won't fit into the boxes. You know, I showed you that Thomas Demand picture of all of those standardized gray archival boxes as a backdrop to one of the slides. In a way, the size of the shelf And the scale of the box, in some sense, according to Foucault and Derrida, determines what's archivable in a way. If it doesn't fit into a box, if it's an ephemeral thing like I don't know, a performative art piece, essentially. If your culture is based on transferring knowledge through dance, how do you capture that in a way that actually gets at the liveness and ephemerality of the performance? So archivists are very much, sometimes maybe just working rotely through the conventions of their profession, like this is the box we have, what fits into it, what doesn't, essentially is disregarded. Like, we can't take your collection, sir, because we don't have the right size boxes for it. But I think it also promotes kind of critical reflection on all the stuff that is maybe meaningful that doesn't make it into the collection because it doesn't fit for any number of reasons. Jason.
I noticed in a lot of your slides, scale always went from left to right, and you read from left to right. So you yourself said to start with small, scale it up. Can you imagine a parallel lecture that reverses that, where the scale of the kind of enormity and vastness of what what you said, what's worth knowing,
Mm-hmm.
begins to kind of generate a family of objects that depart radically from these kind of historical buildups?
Yeah, I mean, that would take a lot of work to reverse engineer it, but I do think that's possible. I mean, if you looked at the pieces I was showing about Paul Atlee, the guy who thought all the world could be put on index cards, you could build a bunch of cabinets, build a world city, and then you'd have this networked world of kind of unity and universal knowledge. You could start with your end goal, and that is universal world harmony and kind of encyclopedic knowledge for the world around. And then think about, there are all kinds of ways you could operationalize that. The internet, the early days of the internet, they thought they were operationalizing that. Facebook thinks it's operationalizing that. Just so happens that index cards were the new media of the day in Paul Atlee's time. He thought he was operationalizing that world vision through what was the new tech of the time. So I think you can reverse engineer based on these big, ambitious principles, but what you reverse, the small parts, could be a variety of different things based on what is new of the day, or not as often is based on what is new, because we have so much faith in the new often. I could have to think a bit more, but that's an interesting challenge. But yeah, the influence definitely does go in both directions. Yes. Well, that's a good question. I don't know if you heard that. Is the pursuit of an encyclopedic knowledge worthwhile?
Because much of what you're working on, what you're working with in art and writing about, thinking about our systems of classification, essentially directed at classifying all human knowledge. And this has been something that for probably most of human history, in one way or another, pursued as an end goal.
Yes. I think it's useful, and this is maybe not a complete answer, but I think it's useful in part that because it is such a timeless thing, we always run up to the point where we realize it's futile. That once we have this is the Dewey Decimal System, the Library of Congress, you might know, have all these kind of racial and religious biases into them. The Dewey Decimal System has dedicated a range of 100 to religions, the world religions. 90% of that is for Christianity. 10% of that is for the rest of the world's religions. In the way women, any form of alternative sexual orientation was relayed as deviance. So the coded language, every time we try to have a universal classification system, or a shelf that will hold everything, or a hard drive. I keep getting new computers because I keep needing bigger hard drives to store all my PDFs. I am building my own kind of universal library in a way. But it's futile. You always run up to the futility, or the fact that the world changes, and your system is kind of locked into its logistics, and it will never live up to the ever-evolving nature of changing nature of culture and knowledge. Mm-hmm.
Because your work covers such a wide range of disciplines and scales, as the presentation shows, how do you decide what to focus on?
That is something I need to get better at asking myself, really. But I've been pretty grateful that people in different disciplines have accepted my work. So I will get invitations from geographers and a lot of architecture schools and urban planners and librarians and archivists. So for the past, since I got tenure, I have to say, about 6 years ago, which is a very liberating thing, that most of my work has been driven by commissions. And that's not to say I get paid, but people will say, intellectual commissions. So they'll say, we saw that we liked your work in this. Could you please write something about this? They won't give me a prescribed topic. They'll say, here's the theme. Where can you find a place where your interests meet that theme? So it's an interesting challenge. It's like, the value of constraints in a design project. If they just say, like, design a building, and that's your studio challenge, like, that is overwhelmingly open. You might be paralyzed by the possibility. So having a thing to push against or to structure is really helpful. So that's the way most of the work is done. The book that just came out was research I've been doing for like 15 years that because I collected so much work, I think I paralyzed myself by thinking I could never actually find a systematic way to write it, where all those little articles I showed you came in the interim. They were great ways to think in little pieces through that bigger project. And then when I got a fellowship with no committees, thank God for one semester, I was able to write the manuscript in Germany, where everything closes at 5 p.m. anyways, and the tiny town where I was. There weren't a lot of distractions. So that was a way, that book happened because I feel like I've collected all this stuff. I've been thinking about it through my classes and in little parts to these articles. This is something that I just have to pull together into a bigger project. But the articles are often, where an invitation meets my interests. Yes?
Thanks, Shannon. I was interested in something you said really early on. You said that the way you work is a kind of exceeds disciplinary bounds, or like you've always been a transgressor of disciplinary bounds. You have been running a lot like that evaluation. But in some ways, I see your talk as exciting and the content in its own right, of course, but like as a survey across your work. Um, could you see it, or do you see it, or could we all see it as like a model by which someone might work in design disciplines, by which you sort of take on things that are not quite like right in the wheelhouse of what you do, and thereby like making a larger case for what you're actually up to. Can you imagine something like that?
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's also based on, I mentioned earlier the whole idea of a lot of students want to take all of these different spatial knowledges and put them into one map. And you realize, like, nobody's going to be able to read that map because it's going to have so much stuff on it. So instead, think of it as an atlas with a succession of things that talk to each other. Similarly, with these types of challenges, I think that cross-disciplinary teams can be really interesting. So, which is why I worked with the Architecture League of New York about 3 or 4 years ago on a library design project. And nearly all the teams that became finalists had a whole mix of people. There were service designers, real estate people, architects, urban planners, library scientists, all on the team together. So their ways of thinking about designing knowledge and space were really informing one another. There was another part I wanted to, another half of that was my response to your question, but I can't remember it. So I think like collaboration can be really helpful. And then, I forget the other part. That's a half useful response, I hope, at least. Yeah.
Stop asking.
Okay. Okay, thanks for having me.